Welcome to the 311 Griffin YouTube channel. Let's do some missile testing. And the reason I'm putting together this video is because I've seen several questions in the last couple of weeks in various forums asking why people aren't hitting with their missiles. And so far, the ones I've seen anyway have always been AIM-120C questions. When I dig into it, every one of them that I've seen so far, the players are launching the missiles either at 30 to 40 miles, which in every case I can think of is going to be outside your maximum range, and that's going to be a missile shot range where you would just be trying to put the other aircraft on the defensive, or the players are firing from a platform that is going less than the speed of sound, or they're doing both. And I remember thinking, when I think back to when I started flying the F-15, I was doing those things as well. And I did some research and realized that I have almost zero chance of hitting my target if I do either of those things, not to mention doing both of those things. So that's what this video is all about. Okay, so my initial experiment whenever I set out to test these missiles was to have a large jet aircraft flying towards my F-16, both at 20,000 feet. I set the large aircraft not to react to threats, and then I would get to different speeds, maintain 20,000 feet, and then fire some just really insane range shots at this aircraft. But the AIM-120 lofts, and I was getting some really weird data, so I decided not to lock any targets up. I would just maintain 20,000 feet, and then at these different speeds, I would launch a missile. I would take down the data, and initially I intended to note the launch speed of the aircraft, what the maximum speed of the missile was, and how many seconds it took to get to that maximum speed, and then how many seconds it took to come back through the speed of sound. Unfortunately, I was not seeing the data I expected to see. What I expected to see was the missile have to use a lot of energy to get through the sound barrier, and then and so if I plot the speed, it would get steeper, or I'm sorry, not steeper. It would get less steep as it tried to accelerate through the sound barrier, and then it would be more or less the same slope as if it was a missile was already through the sound barrier. But I didn't see that. I saw differences in speed and I saw differences in range, but I certainly did not see what I thought I would see, um, which would be we all know that it's hard to get through the sound barrier. It takes a lot of energy to get through the sound barrier. I also, from another hobby that I have, which is shooting guns, sometimes long range, it's well known that the transonic region of flight for a bullet can be very chaotic, and it becomes much less accurate through that region and beyond. So that's what I expected to see, but I didn't see it. And maybe it's because rockets just behave a little bit differently. But in general, the speed graphs, whenever I charted a missile fired from an aircraft going 0.75 Mach, were essentially, for lack of better term, they were essentially parallel to the chart of the speed of a missile that was fired from a platform that was traveling 1.25 Mach. So again, I didn't see what I thought I would see. So then I decided I would go ahead and lock up this compliant target, and I would fire a missile at different speeds at 40 miles. And in every case, I missed the target. A compliant target that's flying straight at the same altitude, the missiles just won't hit it. So I think that if you fire at 40 miles with lock or without, and even if the aircraft is just flying straight in DCS, I don't think you're going to get a missile hit. Now that's not to say it's impossible, but from what I'm seeing, you will not hit the target. Which means that if you're firing a missile in DCS at another jet, at something that can fire back at you, and you're firing it to try to make that jet maneuver, at 40 miles, I don't think that jet has to maneuver to get missed. Now there is a chance that it would get hit, but if you're fighting your friend, for instance, and you're 40 miles away, you've got him on radar, he has you on radar, he or she, whatever. Um, if they're at 40 miles, I don't think you have to worry. If they're at 30 miles, you might start worrying. Um, so anyway, that's what I saw there. Then, since none of those missiles were hitting, no matter how fast I was going, I decided to put in an Su-33, allow it to maneuver, and then fire at maximum range. So at different speeds. Now, maximum range changes depending on how fast you're going. So the computer is adjusting for that, but I just wanted to try it. In no case did I hit the Su-33. The ones that were fired while I was flying above the speed of sound did get closer because they had more speed, they had more energy left to maneuver, but none of them hit. So I will say, though, that if you fire at max range, the aircraft does have to maneuver. So in my case, it was about 24 miles that I was hitting max range. I'd have to go back and look to see um, how different max range was at the different speeds. But essentially, if you fire at max range, you're probably going to miss. But the aircraft has to maneuver. So that's when you need to start thinking about your defensive missile shots. So you saw some little snippets that I found from an external source, and I've linked that in the description. What you'll see if you go to that link, you'll find that this is a paper that was put together to try to make the AIM-120 missile accurate in DCS, accurate to true life in DCS. It is from 2014, and I think some things have been adjusted. We'll talk about that in a moment. But one thing I did find is that the range difference between transonic and supersonic should be about 15%. And this does support what I thought would happen, and it does support what I'm seeing in the data. Now, I did stop testing a little bit earlier than I intended to because of what I was seeing. It looked like I had enough data here to make some judgment calls, and I didn't really need to time other things. So there could be some things that I'd discover if I went ahead and continued the testing the way I intended to from the start. But from what I've seen so far, if I measure the distance from when the maximum speed of the missile is to the initial launch point, and I average my subsonic and supersonic speeds, I'm seeing an 11% difference. Now there should be also at that point, because it's going faster, there should be a longer distance between there and when the missile goes subsonic for the supersonic missiles, and then there should be an increase in overall range as well. So we should see that in sim. So the 15% looks legit to me. One thing I noticed while doing my research is that this paper suggests a 7.75 second burn time, and I'm seeing more like a 6.5 second burn time. Now, this is something that in the real world, I believe, to my knowledge, this is classified. The missile or rocket burn time on these missiles, I don't think is something that is readily available. Some would say we shouldn't even be talking about it, but I think we're just making guesses and looking at real world data that's readily available and then trying to make some assumptions about things in the sim based on that. So I don't necessarily see anything wrong with it. I'm not divulging top secret information here. I'm just pointing out that in this paper, it says 7.75 second burn time. In the sim, it's more like 6.5. I don't think that that's a problem with the sim. I think that that is either an adjustment or they just didn't think that that was correct or something. So anyway, all I'm pointing out is if you go searching for that value, you're likely to find very little, except for perhaps this paper that I've linked. And then in the sim, you're not going to see that kind of performance. So I wanted to make sure that that was clear. Another little quirk that I saw that might just be TAC view is that the missiles, once launched, they tend to kind of jump around a little bit and they accelerate for a very brief period of time and then they jump back to the first value and then accelerate back again before continuing on more realistically. So I'm not for sure if this is in sim or if this is just TAC view, but it is something that I noticed that was a little weird. Okay, so what now? What do we do with this information? I feel like I've answered why your missile shots aren't hitting at 30 and 40 mile launches and subsonic launches, but what's the alternative? What should you do instead? For me, and this isn't perfect, I don't consider myself to be an expert at this stuff, but just what tends to work more often is what you'll see here. I do want to put out a disclaimer. You'll still die sometimes when you employ this tactic, especially if you're not one-on-one. This doesn't necessarily work if there's a really complex um, setup going on, with a lot of opponents and even a lot of friendlies. This doesn't necessarily work. But essentially, you can fire defensive missile shots. They just have to be closer. And so, what I tend to do is I will either crank a little bit after I get my lock, which has some benefit, I think, or if I know I'm one-on-one, um, I'm not necessarily hesitant to fly directly at them because I know how far away they are. And again, this hinges on knowing that you're one-on-one. Now, keep in mind that some missiles you won't get a missile launch warning until the missile's fairly close, or especially against anybody that has a medium-range thermal type missile, you may not get a launch warning at all. So flying directly at the target can be very, very dangerous, but it depends on the situation. So in this particular case, I'm just flying directly at him. Normally, I probably would crank, but for these purposes, it works. Now, I was firing at maximum range, which again was, I think, in this particular situation was about 24 miles. Here, I waited a little bit longer, and sometimes I will even wait for the missile launch warning. Again, that can be kind of dangerous, but so I don't necessarily recommend it. But I'm going to fire what I thought was going to be my defensive missile to kind of make him maneuver. And I fired it later than I intended to here, just because I hadn't gotten a missile launch warning yet. But then I, crank over. I could have cranked a little harder here, but you crank over so that you still have him on the radar. You'll see on the radar screen it's slewed over to the left. So I crank over, keep an eye on him, look for missile trails, and then I'm going to turn back through, and when I'm pointed at him, I'm going to fire what I would consider my kill shot. And that should be, most of the time I try to make that happen about 10 miles away, maybe a little more. There I really should have cranked a little bit more, because I'm assuming he has a missile on the way, but in this particular case, my first shot did make him go defensive, and he didn't have a missile yet, so he had to maneuver very, very hard to avoid that missile, and he never had a chance to shoot at me. So it worked really well in that case. Again, I do want to point out that right before this, I did it where I fired at max range, and he got a missile off before he went defensive. He defeated my max range missile, and then he hit me with the missile that he fired. So this doesn't work every time. And you can't just assume that you're going to be able to defeat the missiles by just doing the same thing over and over again. And I don't know that I can help there because I get shot down fairly often. I have a lot more success than I used to at killing targets because I'm firing more intentionally, and I'm not firing those extreme range shots anymore. So you got to kind of figure out where your missiles are completely wasted and where they can achieve the goal that you want. And sometimes the goal you want isn't to kill the target, it's to make the target turn. It's to make the target maneuver so that you can get in closer. If that's your goal, a 40-mile aim 120 shot isn't really going to do the trick. You have to get a little bit closer. At least from the data I'm seeing, that's the case. So if you can get a little bit closer, fire it at somewhere more like 24, 25 miles maximum. Depending on the situation, you can make that target maneuver, and then you may not get the kill, but you can get in closer. It gives you a little bit of room to work. So there's probably some people out there that are way better at this than me, and if you take this little piece of advice or knowledge and then you go watch those guys, that might make a little more sense as to why they're not firing at 40 miles and that kind of stuff. So I hope this helps. As always, thanks for watching. Happy flying.